Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another episode of The Follow-Up Question. And this is an important one. Before I ask you the question to kick off this episode, I want to let you know this is the last episode of this show as it's named The Follow-Up Question. I am rebranding The Follow-Up Question to a new name. I'll just let the cat out of the bag now. I'm renaming this show Rethinking Communication. And I'll explain this all in the next episode, which will be episode 130. I'll explain why I'm changing the name, but I just want to give you a heads up. A name change is coming. You're going to see different podcast art in your podcast player, wherever you happen to be listening to this episode right now. And so, yeah, exciting things to happen, exciting things to come, and I will explain it all in the next episode. But until then, let's get into this episode, episode 129, and I've got a question for you. Do you believe that you're a creative person? Welcome to The Follow-Up Question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. When my daughter was about 6 or 7 years old, she got out this set of rubber straws that we had in our kitchen drawer, and she began to play with them. They were not perfectly straight straws. They had a little bend or a crook at the top, and so they kind of resembled perhaps a giraffe neck with a giraffe head on the end. But my daughter started playing with these, and she created an entire world with all these different colored straws, drinking straws, these rubber drinking straws, and she called them Zelos. She gave these straws a name, she created this world with them, and she could sit there and play with the Zelos for hours, just lost in the world of the Zelos. And it was just hilarious to watch that out of something as ordinary as 5 or 6 multicolored rubber drinking straws, my daughter could take that creativity, take her imagination, and get lost in that world. And my guest here in this episode laments the loss of that creativity. My guest is Patrick Williams. He's a public speaker, he's a writer, he's an artist, and for more than 4 decades, Patrick has been developing what he calls the philosophy of creativity, and how creativity, we experience interruptions as children that eventually draw that creativity out of us. Usually creativity is the most affected part of the education process that we are subjected to. And I've talked a lot about our education process and its failings here on this podcast, especially as it relates to communication. And this is what Patrick and I get into in this conversation: the collapse of our creativity and the void that is left when we no longer are in tune or in touch with that creativity, and how we can eventually, as you'll hear Patrick talk about, restore that creativity with his approach, the philosophy of creativity. What does that look like? What does that mean? We get into all of that here in this conversation and how it relates to our ability to communicate with each other. As you'll hear Patrick talk about, Communication is as much a creative process as painting a picture or drawing a sketch. In fact, we even heard this same type of reference in episode 103 with Fred Dust when he talked about creative conversation. Not that it was in some way imaginative, but that it was the act of creating an inspired communication or an inspired method of communicating with each other. So we get into this, what it means, Patrick's work in this area here in this episode. I heard that at a very early age, you taught yourself to paint.
Indeed.
I would love to just understand that process for you as we talk about creativity here. How did you do it? How did you go about doing it? And honestly, the question I have is what attracted you to painting so much that you wanted to do it?
Right. That's a great question. Uh, well, I started teaching myself to draw when I was about 10, and that's in the TEDx talk that kind of describes my origin story. But then after a few years, I started to make larger and larger drawings. My mom eventually bought me I think they're 24 inches by 36-inch uh, drawing pads,
Sure.
which I still have. And I filled probably four of them. And I can't remember exactly when I thought of actually painting. I grew up in a very small house. We didn't have much money. The only painting on the wall was the paint by numbered Jesus praying at a rock. And the origin of that is confusing. My mom said she painted it. My sister said she painted it. So it's up for grabs. So I had no reference except doing painting in school on a small scale. But eventually, I just asked my mom if she would give me if we could go to the store and get a small canvas pad, which is somewhat like paper, but made of canvas. And it just comes in a set of like ten sheets in a pad, and a little beginner set of acrylic paints. And I got those. I got a space on the dining room table, which was usually full of stacks of things, and just started sort of painting the images that I had been drawing, which
Mhm.
makes sense. I wasn't attempting. Which is interesting. I didn't look at objects. I didn't get an apple and paint the apple. I instantly went to my imagination rather than looking at objects in the house. When I started drawing objects in the house. But then I quickly went into, uh, for better purposes. At the time, I didn't know it, but it was more of a surreal approach. I was very into science fiction when I was a kid. Uh, I'm in the generation that uh, Lost in Space and Star Trek were
Ah,
on mainstream TV,
yeah, gotcha.
so I was steeped in that. And uh, Outer Limits was in that time period, and The Twilight Zone was a little bit earlier, but it was still running. So I had lots of visual information to kind of spur me. But I had then, and I still have a really rich imagination that I could visualize things in my mind's eye, but in a way at that time when I was young, I would in some ways pretend to project them out into the world. Does that make sense? It's it's,
Uh,
it's
uh,
kind of esoteric, but
yeah, explain what that means. I have a couple questions there, but explain what you mean project that out into the world.
so I would visualize a dinosaur in the yard, or visualize an eagle coming flying into the house, or and as best as I could to visualize it as if it was there in sort of a a preliminary to a virtual reality,
I was
right?
gonna say, it sounds like you're creating VR with your
Yeah, yeah.
with your
When in
mind.
the early '70s,
Right.
which is basically, that's what all of us were doing as visual artists is seeing it, and then the trick is uh, getting it on a piece of paper or on a canvas, which is sometimes seemingly simple, but then all kinds of complications begin to happen when trying to do that.
Oh
And
yeah.
and the I have a whole bunch of ideas about that are connected to the beginning painting process. But go ahead with other questions that you said you were.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say I wanted to know what you painted. It sounds like kind of abstract or maybe ethereal, not really of anything. I drew a lot as a child as well. Um, Birds mainly.
Nice.
Birds were my thing. But it's funny, we're having to talk about creativity and imagination, and you were talking about that. I every so often would morph into I would combine animals. And I still do it
Ooh,
today for my kids to make them laugh. My favorite was I created a craccoon, which is a cross between a crow and a raven, if you can imagine that.
nice.
Um, so I wanted to ask, when we think about that creativity and that imagination that you came to really appreciate and
Mm,
understand as a child, I've heard you in several other interviews talk about the loss of that
mm,
as we get older
mm,
and its effect that it has on our ability to communicate with each other. But the starting point, what do you say to the people that are like, I've never been creative? I'm not a creative person.
mm.
Um, how do you approach that?
I've been thinking about this very deeply for quite a while. I have a couple manuscripts that I'm promising myself I'll complete in 2024. So I'm saying it again to audiences, so it puts pressure on me to really get it accomplished. And that specific issue is something that so many people ask. And last night, my wife and I we each night we have what we call D&D, drinks and dialogue. It's when we get together. We both work out of home, and so we get together and discuss what we're doing, what we're discovering, what we're thinking about, what conversations lag over. So this conversation about what what I say to people who say I have never been creative. And I'm formulating this concept that I'm calling generalized creativity and specialized creativity. So I believe that everyone as human beings has generalized creativity. And generalized creativity has it's on a spectrum. So some things are choosing the shirt I was going to wear today for the podcast was
Mhm.
small on the spectrum of generalized creativity. It didn't take much creative energy for me to choose it. But in our lives we have moments when we have to be much more creative. We when we're planning a trip. That's generalized creativity. So it's a creative process that we have to engage in to get to our goal. Otherwise, we flounder. It's like, oh, I don't know where I'm going to go. I can't decide if I want to go to Colorado or if I want to go to California. But that in and itself is part of the creative process when we're fumbling around. That's an important part. But generalized creativity is much different than specialized creativity. Specialized creativity is what we see in the arts, in the sciences, in the world of invention, business innovation, to a degree. And there's a spectrum of specialized creativity, I also believe. The arts, obviously, I'm biased, but I do believe that the arts hold a very unique quality in our world cultures and our personal culture of of an expression that touches on beauty, form, and redemption, as Sir Roger Scruton speaks of eloquently. These are hence specialized. It takes a very focused determination and dedication to get into the specialized. Yet I separate that so people don't feel overwhelmed or in a place where they could never achieve something specialized. We achieve things creatively every day. They're small on the spectrum, and sometimes they're larger. So I encourage people to realize that, one, they are generally creative, but there's also a part of them that I've spoken about quite a bit, is that when we're young, we have a natural ability in some ways to be in a special quality of the specialized creativity. We're natural. When we're children, we are completely natural in our creative processes, whether they're make believe or drawing or singing, dancing, movement, whatever it might be. We just simply do it. When we were 5 years old, we didn't sit down and have a meeting about how are we going to be creative this afternoon. We'd get together with our friends and just invent things spontaneously. That's what children do. They have access to a quality of creativity that is uh, universal, vast, and I believe we retain that in different ways all throughout our lives. But like you said, we tend to lose connection to that for a variety of reasons. Many for each individual person. There are many reasons why we drift from our core innate creativity. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. What you just said, this concept of retained creativity that we take with us into
Mm.
adulthood, go back. Why do we, hmm, maybe a little bit of a leading question here, but do you find that we don't often look back at our childhood and what you just said as I could go out and play and create an entire world in my backyard? Do we look at that as creativity, or is that just like summed up as being, oh, a child being a child?
Mm.
I'm curious about this retained creativity, or on the flip side, the ways that creativity is kind of drawn away from us as we get older. And I want to get your thoughts on that. But in looking back at our childhood, do we look at our childhood through the creative lens enough?
I don't think so. I want people to reconnect with that, because I think I believe it's incredibly rich with ways in which we can communicate or are able to communicate. I firmly believe, and this is based on a lot of different folks' research and scholarly investigation. I firmly believe that learning happens, capital L learning. Learning happens through play, especially for children. All children learn through play. And I group into the realm of play imagination and creativity. It doesn't it's difficult to tease them away from each other as we're children. And there's reasons why in our social context, in our family context, in our school context, institutions, the arc of our ability to retain our creativity and our play and our imagination becomes diminished because of other obligations, basically. Right? I'm saying
Yeah.
this very politely, that I use the term creative colonization to demonstrate how children are invaded by other languages that are not their first language. I believe our first language is connected to play,
Mm,
imagination, and learning.
mhm.
That's how I mean, when you think about it, it is astoundingly remarkable how little children learn to speak a language. It's seemingly effortless, right? They learn to walk, they learn to run, they learn to speak a language. They eventually learn to write the language, and then uh, if they're lucky, they have two languages or three languages that they're able to speak in. So those all are learned through play, and and it doesn't quite look like play to us as adults because in some ways we've lost that connection. But the connection is absolutely paramount for people to reconnect to that playful, imaginal, and uh, creative qualities that they have as children. And the losing of that connection is what creates problems. And I think it creates problems in how we communicate. We communicate better if we're more imaginal. What we're doing right now is incredibly creative. What you do as a podcaster is super creative because you're asking questions, but you have some in mind, but then something I say suddenly, oh, I want to ask that question. As the journalist in you knows that that's where the sweet spot of the conversation is. I don't know what I'm going to say, so it's improvisational to some degree. I know my material. I have access to all that, and I have ways in which I have said things, but I often try not to repeat or use the same analogies, especially if, like for my friends, is like, oh, listen to a new podcast that I did. It's like, Patrick, you're saying the same things. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that for myself, and I don't want to do that for the the audiences that are listening. So I'm trying to improv my way back to the original question, and 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 I don't think I'm there yet. So
It's
help me
okay.
out.
It's all right. And I've never thought of it that way, Patrick, that the work that I'm trying to do with the show in
Mm,
trying to get you, because my goal is to get you to not to, I want to ask you questions that get you talking about things you've never talked about
you're
before,
right,
right?
right, totally.
I've never thought of it as a creative endeavor for me. And I guess the question that comes out of that is, what is the barrier that comes up for us as we age, as we grow out of
Mm,
childhood into adolescence and then eventually into our teens and into
mm,
adulthood? What are the barriers that we are faced with that I'll say block
hmm
us from thinking that even just you and I having this conversation right now and you trying to bring unique information and me trying to get unique information out of you,
hmm
why do we not think that's creative?
That's a great question, and I'm I'm forever digging into that question. There seems to be little bits and pieces of information that I'm stumbling upon, or I have privy to because of my unique background and makeup and the things I've focused on throughout my life. I think that has given me a a quirky and unique way to look at this idea of creativity, but it is baffling. In Think of things in your life that you find incredibly natural and easy to do, and then you come across a person. Let's say it's skiing because you're in college. I don't know if you ski,
I
but
don't ski, I
okay.
hike.
So let's say there is a skier, and speaking to someone who doesn't ski, there's a limited amount of communication that can happen about why it's so awesome to ski and what you feel and how the snow feels and the altitude and the trees and whatever it might be. I'm not a skier either, so I was making that up. That happens to me also with respect to creativity. When someone says, I couldn't draw a straight line with a ruler, or I can only draw a stick figure. I've heard all of those things, but I always attempt to find the things in their life that they do express a kind of creativity with. Uh, but I think that there are qualities in how we have been pushed away from our primary language. And this is help me with this if it's strange or obtuse or
Sure.
confusing or whatever.
Sure.
And I mentioned it earlier. So I think that many people lose connection to their creativity because they experience this kind of colonization. They experienced emotional events that are small or large that put up barriers with a specific creative process. For me, I had a creative colonization and a creative collapse is the next stage that I talk about with respect to music. In third grade, we would spend time learning to play the song flute.
Hmm.
They're kind of a little recorder.
Hmm.
Uh, I was it, it was like if the teacher was trying to teach me Chinese. I had no clue. I was a slow speak. I learned to speak late in my childhood. I was 3 and older, and and then reading and writing, that was all foreign to me. So when we got to putting those little notes on the blackboard between those 5 little lines, I had no idea what she was. I was working on the alphabet and reading, you know, Dick and Jane. So I had no idea. I would just move my fingers because if I made sound, everybody would look at me because I was just making sounds. I wasn't making music. So I had a block. I love music. I listen to music all the time, but playing music was always a stumbling block for me because I experienced these emotional intense moments in my life, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of shame, all these things that are heavy on children and on adults, of course. But it's so in this description of my own blockage, is it making a little sense about?
I think so. And
Okay.
the question that comes out for me, Patrick, is it seems to be, and you tell me how you think you see this. It
Hmm.
seems to be that a lot of this blockage or this creative colonization, as you talked about, and I would love for you to define that a little bit more.
Hmm.
But it seems to be that that comes out of when we begin to compare ourselves to others,
Absolutely.
our creativity to others,
Hmm.
drawing I see, or painting.
Hmm.
We compare our ability to throw some paint on a canvas to Bob Ross, or even the artwork behind you that I assume you
Sure.
did that I can see,
Yes.
uh, and and we begin to internalize this message of mine doesn't look like that, so it must be wrong. Am I getting close?
Totally. That's a huge part of it, and it changes with age.
Oh, how so?
Uh, about age 10 for sure and older, you take some 12-year-olds or and then especially junior high age kids, and they will not risk picking up a pencil because it's not going to come out perfect. It's not going to come out like a photograph. There's a famous story that I've yet to find primary source, and I can't even remember where I heard it, but it is of Raphael standing outside of the Sistine Chapel as it had been opened to the public. All these people are seeing it for the first time. He walks up to Michelangelo and says, "How could you have done this to us?" Essentially, one of the greatest painters ever, and in a time when there were immensely great painters everywhere in Italy, says essentially the second or third greatest painter alive behind Da Vinci and Michelangelo, says, "My God, look at what you did. How can we do anything else since you did this? Where can we go? Look what you've done to us." And it is both, it's a little slight, but it's accurate. So as a painter, 500 years later, what am I thinking? Why should I even pick up a brush? But we have this feeling inside of us to express, and that is what we have when we're children. It's innate. It is who we are. It's part of our soul, literally,
Mm,
is to be creative, is to reflect the beauty and joy of creation. So there's a I assist people in understanding that there's scale, and especially with children, there's scale to ability. That you're starting out, you're 13 years old, and you're not going to make a drawing that is photoreal yet. With some practice, that's certainly possible. There's some really amazing photoreal graphite artists that they can
yes,
make things that are unbelievably, like it looks like a black and white photograph.
agreed. Yeah, it's
But
incredible.
in scale, that is going to take you more than one attempt at drawing a, a glass. It's keeping people in scale with how they're approaching, and with children, it's challenging. So the comparison thing stops children, and once children stop, it's immovable. They have an immovable presence to them. Whenever, do you have kids?
I do. Two
Yeah.
kids,
Okay. How old are they?
13 and 11.
Okay. Well, yeah. So you're right in the middle
I'm right
of
there.
oh yeah. That's yeah. So you've seen all levels of children's immovability, right? When they
Yeah.
decide something, at times, it changes. As a 3-year-old's immovability is different than a 5-year-old's, and an 11 and a 13-year-old's. They have different immovable stances, so to speak. And the comparison is challenging. So, and there are different ways that you can work with different age groups, and in some ways, the adults are the worst. Oh, I, I'll re, I'll correct myself. The adults are more challenging.
There you
Not
go.
to say that we're the worst.
So that is fascinating to me, and I definitely want to go there. This remembering what it was like
Mm,
and our distance from that. I want to go there, but before I do, define creative colonization. How
sure.
you defined it, because you've mentioned it a couple times, and I want to make it clear for the folks listening what that is.
Yeah. This is exclusively my terminology that I'm working on. In uh, one of the manuscripts is called A Philosophy of Creativity. Creative colonization happens when a child, as they move through school, especially I think the core of it is in school, but it happens in social contexts, and it happens in the home also in different ways. But in school, it's very obvious because there is a very strict regimen of academic study that has been laid out very specifically. Every school system, every state, and even federally, we have these curricula
Hmm.
that first graders have to accomplish this, second graders have to accomplish this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, with all those objectives, the thing that becomes less and less available to children is free time. And free time and play and imagination and creativity are rolled into one. And the colonization happens because I believe our first language, our natural language, how we discover the world, how we invent our relationship to the world, happens through our playful experiences. When we're in school, we have no room for those we have less and less room for those playful experiences. And that, to me, is a form of colonization. When the invading force enters the child's psyche, the invading force is the school curriculum. That invading force pushes out their natural languages, their intercultural attributes, their rituals, and their, I'm trying to think of all the things that a colonizing force pushes out of a native culture. Picture that, and that's my description of what creative colonization is. It's a strong term, and I firmly believe this process is incredibly detrimental to human beings in general. And there's lots of studies that are connected to, oh, but everybody needs to have this amount of math. A child could be completely disinterested in math until they're 17 years old. They haven't done, they know nothing about multiplication, division, anything. And then something happens and they get completely engaged in mathematics. They could win the field prize in 5 years. If their interest is incredibly focused and passionate, they love it, then they're going to discover things. It's the natural flow of our interests that we pursue. For me, it was visual arts. I love it today. I loved it when I was 10, and even before that. So it's the colonization is happening sometimes maliciously, and sometimes uh, it it's like this the like a fortress being, I can't think of the word, a siege on a fortress.
Mm.
So the invading army just sits out there and waits till everybody inside starves, and then they take over the castle. Children are kind of under siege with with all of this academic, and sometimes that isn't correct for that individual person, or in a way, boys tend to come to reading later than girls. Boys tend to come to mathematics later than girls. Boys tend to come to physical activity sooner than girls. And these are generalizations. They're not always accurate, but
Right.
in general, these are known. For me, as an example, I not only did I not want anything to do with reading as much as my teachers were trying to get me to read, I had no intention, but I read vociferously now. So it's when the child is ready, the learning will occur. Kind of playing on that, when the student's ready, that the master will appear. So when the child's ready, there's no stopping the learning because they're passionate about it. Does that make sense? Does that?
It does.
Okay. And did I get to?
Well, I just got so many more questions come up in
Okay.
there. I'm struck by it's comparison again, is it not, Patrick?
Sure.
The curriculum, the standards that you must meet at each grade level, you are compared to some standard that was set by some panel of experts somewhere,
Right.
and your learning is forced into that comparison rather than kind of what I hear you arguing for is more self-driven, more creative, right? I mean, let's use that word. It is
Yes.
more created out of the person rather than forced upon them. Am I accurately voicing this?
Totally.
Yeah.
100%.
Okay, and I heard you say in there, to build on that, it's not to do away with the academic side and go all creative and just like free loosey goosey. So what does that look like? But like, let's be practical. What does it look like to marry the creative and the academic comparison that we've kind of talked about here to where we are building up generations, but we're doing it in a creative way?
Right. Yeah, it looks, I mean, there's lots of experimental groups out there. The democratic school groups, I'm blanking on some of their names right now.
I will interject here and say my children go to one of the only elementary schools, well, went to one of the only elementary schools in the country that does artful learning curriculum. I don't know if you've
Nice.
heard of this. And I noticed distinctly when my son left that elementary school to go to middle school, he ended up hating school.
Mm, interesting.
It was a very interesting switch to happen, and I just attributed it to, like, preteen, teenager hormones, but as we're having
Sure.
this conversation, I'm like, yeah, like, learn everything in his elementary school and where my daughter goes, it is all tied back to art in some way or some form of
Mm,
creative expression. It doesn't always have to be modeling things out of clay, for instance, but it is trying to bring out that creativity. So I was just struck by that as you were starting to talk about all the different models.
absolutely.
So as we start to kind of wrap things up here, Patrick, and man, there's so much. um, I heard you say in as I was doing some research here that we experience interruptions to our learning processes as children, and this usually creativity is affected. The restoration of our innate creativity is what's needed.
Mm,
How do we do that? I, as a almost 40-year-old man, you as almost 41, I'm gonna guess, right?
almost. I'm closing in on it
Uh,
quickly.
how do we introduce that to ourselves as adults? How do we bring that idea in of this creativity and not have it feel like child's play? And
Sure.
like, and I use that in air quotes, like kitty. How do we do
Right.
that?
Well, there's ways to do that. There's several ways. I usually attempt to get people to think about their childhood a bit. If let's say you're interested, I would invite you to spend some time. If you have a journaling process, that's awesome. But if you don't, start a journaling process. Get a journal. These are the journals I have. They're blank
Mhm.
that I write in every day, and use that as an entry point of asking yourself questions,
Hey.
sort of like follow-up questions.
Hey, hey.
Yeah, it's right up your alley.
I'm loving
So
this.
ask yourself, what did I love to play at when I was 4, if you can go back that far, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, anywhere in there, anywhere before 10-ish. It starts to get a little complicated, 8, 9, and earlier now these days when kids are pushed to, in some ways, to mature more
Mhm.
quickly.
Yeah.
And I think the screen is a big factor in that.
Mhm.
But ask yourself questions. What did I get lost in? Was it make believe? I lived out in the country and we were out in the woods all the time. And we would create the Starship Enterprise or whatever else our imagination would come up with things that weren't connected to TV or anything. Also, but what were you passionate about? What would you get lost in? And then use that to then ask more questions. How have I been doing that in maybe little bits and pieces throughout the rest of my life? Since the 30 years since you were 10 or the 35 years since you were 5. Is there a creative thread in the fabric of your psyche that connects you to the tapestry of your creative youth? Once you have that thread, then you can begin to create a contemporary tapestry of your creativity. It may not be what it was then, but there may be, you had information, you were experiencing information then, you were you were collating, you were absorbing and learning through your play and creativity and your imagination then to become who you are and who you have been. So those threads of creativity interweave your life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can backtrack by asking yourself questions. It it's all inside.
Yeah.
All the answers are there. It's just a matter of asking the right question, or asking a bunch of questions, asking a bunch of wrong questions, asking questions that don't have answers, asking, you know, all those things. Just start to explore. Give yourself the freedom to discover these things inside you that you haven't. Literally, you'll think of things ideally that I hadn't thought of that for years. I
Hmm.
used to love to play with little animal figurines, or, you know, play cars, or whatever it might be. All kinds of things. Music, it could have been instruments. You could have played air guitar or whatever it might be. Those are informative to your your baseline creative energy. We all have it. Mine is high level visual baseline creative energy. That's where 95% of all my creativity is visual. Spend time journaling and exploring and asking yourself questions. Uh, Ask relatives. They're a good source of when I was 5, what was I doing when I was playing? And they may not remember, but they may come up with some things that you were like, "Oh, I did do that." I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of that for years, right? So those will inform you. Once you have a little bit of that tapestry started to form, there may be an image in it that is a guitar, or it's a pencil, or it's movement, something maybe that you'll start to get a glimmer of, ooh, I want to pursue that. Or it suddenly an idea may pop into your mind of poetry. Even though you weren't doing poetry, not many of us when we're 5 were doing poetry, but some of us were in a way. Explore that. And there's no right or wrong direction. This is your mountain range, your planet of creativity, your whole solar system, or whatever big analogy you want to use. It's all yours. And it's infinite. It doesn't stop. It's surprising. Allow yourself to be surprised by what you're discovering, and follow that for a little bit, and follow it without an expectation that, if you do start thinking about playing the piano and you've never done that, don't call up Carnegie Hall in a month and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about booking you for a concert." You keep it in scale, right? So be be uh, be gentle with yourself. I want people to extend that into a kind of, it's different, but a reverence for their generalized creativity, to really appreciate that. You know what? That was going to be a really, really challenging conversation, as you noted in one of the podcasts I listened to of yours, of speaking to the atheist.
Yes.
But you knew that I need to go there. I need to push myself. And I believe you were relying on a immense amount of creative processing inside, but then while it was happening, to maintain and sustain your focus. Is that Somewhat accurate?
I feel that, Patrick, and I appreciate you for giving me a different language to describe that. I don't know that
Mm,
I would have described that as a creative process until our conversation today.
mm,
So thank you for
you're
that. I
welcome.
appreciate that. What is a question that you wish you were asked more, Patrick?
Gosh, that's a great question. What do I wish I was asked more? I think I think being asked about the emotional qualities of my artwork. It's easy for me to, as there's a huge amount of technical events that happen to make a painting, and and those are easy to get wrapped up in, and it's fun to describe the things that have to happen in order, this one first, then this one, then that one, and the complexity of color mixing and the choice of brush and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But talking about what's the feeling of this painting? What were you feeling when you were making it? What was the feeling of inspiration? Where does inspiration come from? Those kinds of questions are deep and fascinating and fun and challenging.
Well, I'll ask it like this. What is your favorite emotional state to create in?
Oh, wow. I don't think that there's I think is it's being inside of the emotional state. So I think I cover, for someone who paints essentially every day and almost through my entire life. Obviously there are days that it doesn't happen, and then some periods of my life have been, other things were, family crises or whatever it might be. But as a person that paints every day, I go through an everyday quality of emotional experiences. So it's not just. I think it's almost impossible to stay in a state of anger, because that's what the painting is about. All the time you're painting the painting. Even Beethoven, as energetically rough he was, he wasn't always obsessively, intensely banging on his desk in frustration or in exaltation. He went through a gamut of emotions. So I think the practice for me is to notice those emotions and to honor them when they're coming up, and to make special note of it. If I am really expressing a piece that has anger in it, I need to really touch in on that,
Mhm.
touch in on the anger, and touch in on how I feel when I'm angry, asking myself those questions, and seeing if I can put that into the into the painting or the drawing.
Well, Patrick, I have enjoyed this conversation. Like I said, you've given me some new language. You've given me some new things to think about and a new way to describe even the creativity of communication. So I appreciate you, sir. Thank you so much for the conversation, and all the best to you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
I really want to highlight the question Patrick posed and that we discussed in this conversation about the reasons why and how we compare our creativity to each other and the differences between generalized creativity and specialized creativity. If you recall, specialized creativity is, hey, I can go and draw a sketch from memory. I don't need a picture in front of me, or I don't need to trace an outline of anything. That's specialized. Or if I can create a clay pot, or heck, if I can create a beautiful landscape in my backyard just from the thoughts and ideas and images in my head, those are specialized creativity. And what we talked about was generalized creativity, the ability to approach a situation or a conversation or an issue or a challenge or a conflict from a creative place where you're thinking about building and bringing in other thoughts and ideas and opinions to create and mold something greater than the initial inspiration for that conversation, perhaps. And again, I want to reference back to another episode, like I did in the intro. If you go back to episode 52 and that episode and that conversation with Matthew Barzin, he talked about co-creation of new solutions to big problems and challenges that we face. And I believe that that is essentially what Patrick and what Fred Dust talked about back in episode 103 and what Matthew talked about in episode 52 is this coming together of ideas, this blending and molding together of our generalized creativity, our ability to think of new solutions, to consider different points of view and how they might fit together. Humans are wildly adept at doing that. But when we begin to compare our creativity, or when we begin to compare our strengths or our morals and our values to each other and begin to distance ourselves from each other in that comparison, we lose the ability to co-create. We lose the ability to construct creative conversations. And we want to restore that. Patrick, in his philosophy of creativity and the creative collapse and void and tension and restoration that he talked about in this conversation, that's all building to this creative process that is communication that allows us to lean into those uncomfortable moments where we blend our generalized creativity together to think of new ways to address the issues and problems in front of us. Consider that, reflect on that as we end this episode here today. I want to thank Patrick Williams for joining me here on the show. If you enjoyed this conversation with Patrick, please do Patrick and I a favor and share this episode with your network. Help us spread the good word about the importance of creativity and about communication and about the power of asking really great, awesome questions. Share this show, share this episode, share this podcast with one other person that you know and help me grow this show and its reach. If you would ever like to get in contact with me, you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there, or you can always email me. It's michael@thefollowupquestion.com. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, which will have a new name. If you recall in the intro, we're going to be calling this show Rethinking Communication, and I'll explain why. But until then, keep asking questions.